Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Paul, and in this Gaming Telecom video, how well does this graphics card perform in 2019? It is an Nvidia GeForce GTX 780 Ti, and it was launched in November-ish of 2013, which means it's pretty darn old, to say the least, for graphics card technology. This card, though, when it was launched, was an absolute beast, featuring 2880 CUDA cores. It actually had more CUDA cores at the time than the then flagship Titan, which prompted Nvidia to launch a subsequent Titan which had an additional set of CUDA cores to match the 780 Ti. It has 384-bit memory interface and sports 3 gigabytes of memory. And that might give you a clue to the main issue with this card, which we'll get into when we start discussing the performance of the GPU. Now, this particular model is one that I actually bought back in the day. And in fact, as a slight aside, it was the card that I was actually rocking here in the early parts of Red Gaming Tech when we were more focused on game reviews than anything else. And I was incredibly proud of myself when I purchased this card. It represented, at the time anyway, the pinnacle of the type of performance you could get out of PCs. It pretty much decimated games like Crysis, and it made your games look absolutely amazing. Cards from AMD did come to the scene, such as the R9 290X and other GPUs, which did actually compete fairly favourably, with this particular card. But that was the past. What about the present? How does this card compare against a GTX 980 Ti, which we've also put out a video on, along with a GeForce GTX 1080? We'll be answering how well it performs in just a moment, but there is a small thing I need to brief you on, and that is that this is a superclocked model from EVGA. The reason that that's so important is because the clock speeds of this particular GPU are ramped up significantly compared to the reference design. The reference design, if memory serves, is around 928 MHz for the core, whereas, for example, this card hits almost 1100. So it's not just, 10 MHz or something additional. No, this is quite substantial. But even so, let's just be honest, I think a card such as the GTX 780 Ti, given the fact it's pretty old, is going to need all the help it can get. So, with further ado, let's start looking at some results. Starting things off with Gears of War 4 running Ultra. This game actually fares fairly well with the GTX 780 Ti. We're hitting over 60 FPS in the in-game benchmark. Superposition, meanwhile, is not quite so good, with 1080p Extreme, and we score around the 2400 points mark, and we also get told that we are over the VRAM allocation. More on that in a moment. Far Cry 5 at 1080p skirts just under 60 FPS for the average, but even so, it's still fairly playable at 1080p. 1080p for Batman Arkham Knight, and we certainly have a lot more wiggle room to play with here, and we could certainly crank the resolution up. Rise of the Tomb Raider, 67.45 FPS average for 1080p. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is a lot heavier on the GPU, with the highest quality preset reaching 39 FPS, and quite honestly, I would not want to suggest running this at a high resolution, but you could certainly start playing around with the quality settings, and with Final Fantasy 15 on the highest as well, we see that it's certainly playable and certainly not awful, but the performance is not going to set the world alight. And when we're actually playing the game as well and trying out various titles, well, yeah. The problem is with this card that we ran out of VRAM. This was very obvious with higher quality settings with Wolfenstein 2, but even games such as Resident Evil 2 Remake, of course, running at the higher quality textures, and you're definitely going to start noticing some stuttering. So then, what's the verdict of the GTX 780 Ti? Well, being honest with you, if you see one on eBay, they are going fairly cheap. Obviously, depending on your region and just what sellers at the time are asking, anything from around the $50 to $100 would be considered what I can see the average price here. And that's not terrible given the performance of this card. However, the problem is, of course, you can get much more modern GPUs which would put out considerably more performance for not that much more. And of course, this GPU as well is not exactly gentle on power consumption. It's got an 8 and a 6 pin power connector, and the reference design models are 250 watt TDP, which is pretty darn insane. But still, it's fairly impressive that a card which is, well, bloody old, to be honest with you, is capable of putting out a level of performance that is still pretty decent in most titles. Yes, you might need to make a couple of concessions here or there with textures, but yeah, overall, this card is not particularly awful. In fact, I will admit, in certain games, it did perform slightly better than what I anticipated. Am I suggesting that you rush out and buy this card? No. But I do think that this is a nice, interesting conversation piece, if anything else. And it does show you one of the cool things about PC gaming, that even an older piece of hardware such as this, if you're willing to make some sacrifices in terms of texture quality or lighting quality or shadows and blah, 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 it's still a fairly capable piece of kit. Then again, if you can compare this GPU against one of the others on our test setup here, and you can see that there is a significant difference. The VRAM limitations of the GTX 780 Ti were a concern. Even when I actually picked this up back in the day, I did wish that this card had more memory than what Nvidia loaded on it. And obviously, one of the benefits of AMD cards at the time, such as the 290, 290X and blah blah blah, was that AMD not only had more memory, but they also had a wider bus. So that definitely was one way that, let's say, the 290X is still pretty relevant today, with the 290X and the RX 480, for example, being roughly comparable in performance. And so that does mean that those cards in, many titles have aged better than the GTX 780 Ti. But with that said, this particular model, this particular card, does hold a special place in my heart. And it was the card that for a while was the GPU that pretty much we started our GT with. And you know what? It was that card where I was incredibly happy to have purchased it. I was incredibly happy to have enjoyed the titles with it. And so I don't think I'm ever going to get rid of this card. This card is going to be one of those GPUs I just want to keep for the memories, as silly as that might sound. But for gaming, for high performance, no, it's not, of course, going to be able to keep up with even the lower to mid-range cards of Nvidia and AMD. But still, it's fun to try out old hardware, at least in my personal opinion. This is another video in this series of where I'm testing out older hardware, which is going to continue here at RGT, because I just find it fun, to be totally honest. So if you're new to the channel, well, you can subscribe for more silly content, as well as some more serious content. And, well, okay, let's just be honest, more silly content just generally. And you can also like the video, which helps us out a lot. And share it as well on social media if you thought this was kind of fun. But other than that, take care of yourselves. Bye for now.